Ever catch a kid just like effortlessly soaking up something new? Like they pick up a language just by being around it, or they nail a cartwheel without even like thinking about it. You ever
Mm,
notice that?
definitely, definitely.
It's pretty wild, right? Makes you wonder like what's going on there. Well, turns out there's this fascinating concept called the critical period. It's a shet in Japanese.
Okay.
And it's basically this prime window of time when our brains are just wired to learn certain skills way more easily.
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. So basically, it suggests that during this specific window, our brains are just like super sponges, right? They soak up new information and skills, and learning feels almost like second nature.
Like it's almost automatic, right? You don't even have to try that hard.
Right.
Okay, so let's like get into some specific examples because our sources really highlight how crucial this critical period is for things like language, especially like our native language, the one we grow up with. It seems like the sweet spot is from birth to about 7 years old.
Yeah, that's right. The research really shows that after around age 10, achieving that true native-like fluency becomes a real uphill battle.
It's so true. I've seen it firsthand with friends who tried to learn a new language later in life. No matter how hard they work at it, there's often this subtle something that gives them away as not being a native speaker.
It's all about those subtle nuances and accents that are so much harder to master once you're past that critical period.
Yeah.
And it's not just limited to native languages, right? This applies to learning a second language too, even though the timeline stretches out a bit longer to adolescence.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like you still have a better shot at fluency if you start younger. So are you saying it's up until around 12 to 15?
Generally, yeah, that's the idea. But what I found really interesting in the sources is that they point out how nailing that perfect native level accent in a second language is often the hardest thing to achieve, especially if you start after around age 7. It's those early years that really shape how we hear and produce sounds. Like I can still remember trying to roll my R's in Spanish class and sounding totally ridiculous.
I can totally relate to that. I still cringe remembering my early attempts at French pronunciation.
Right. Definitely missed that critical window for a perfect accent.
How it's like you see these kids, they move to a new country, they're surrounded by a new language, and boom, before you know it, they're speaking fluently with perfect accents. It's almost like magic.
Right. It really does highlight how powerful that early learning period is.
But let's talk about the science behind it. What's actually happening in our brains during those critical periods that makes learning so darn efficient?
Well, the key lies in what's known as neuroplasticity.
Neuroplasticity.
Yeah, it's a UN pastina in Japanese. Think of it like this. Your brain is like a massive network of roads, okay? And when you're young, it's like super easy to build new roads quickly.
Okay, I'm with you.
But as you get older, building those new roads becomes a bit tougher. But you can still, like, widen the existing ones or even create some shortcuts to make things a bit easier to navigate.
Yeah.
That's basically what neuroplasticity is all about. It's the brain's ability to form these new connections and reorganize the existing ones. So even though it becomes a bit tougher, we don't completely lose our ability to learn and adapt. It just takes a bit more effort.
That's a really helpful analogy. So it's not like our brains become totally rigid as we age, right? It's more like they're just less flexible.
Exactly. And during those critical periods, that flexibility is at its peak. So those new neural pathways needed for learning are established much more easily and quickly.
It makes you realize how powerful those early years really are, how much potential is packed into those little brains.
It really does. I mean, just think about it.
Yeah.
Kids are like learning machines. Everything is new and exciting to them, and their brains are primed to soak it all up.
And one of our sources actually shares a pretty humbling anecdote about this. The author talks about how their young child managed to surpass their English ability
Really? Wow.
in just a couple of years, even though the author had been studying English for over a decade.
That's amazing. It really illustrates the impact of that early learning window, doesn't it?
It really does. And I think it's natural for us adult learners to hear about this critical period stuff and feel a bit, well, maybe a little discouraged. Like, oh no, did I miss the boat?
Yeah, I get that. It's easy to think, well, great, so all my attempts at finally learning the guitar are doomed.
Exactly. Like, I'm too old for this now, but that's not the whole story, right?
Not at all.
That's not why we're doing this whole deep dive today. What we really want to explore is how we, as adults, can still become more effective learners, even if we feel like that critical period has sailed.
Right.
Because what we found in our research is actually pretty exciting. There are some intriguing possibilities out there that suggest maybe, just maybe, that window of prime learning isn't bolted shut after all.
Exactly. That's what I'm excited to dive into.
Okay, so let's start with this. Could we actually reopen the critical period?
Okay.
One of our sources actually references a Radiolab episode called The Ecstasy of an Open Brain, which is all about this possibility.
I've heard of that episode. Yeah, it was a fascinating listen.
It's amazing. They talk about this experiment where they gave MDMA to mice. But these mice were past the critical period for learning social behaviors, and get this, it seemed to reactivate their ability to learn those social cues.
Really?
Isn't that crazy?
Yeah, that's pretty amazing.
It's like they were able to unlock this youthful plasticity in their brains, even though they were supposedly too old for it.
What's even more interesting is that this wasn't just specific to MDMA. They talked about how other psychedelic substances like LSD and psilocybin produced similar effects.
Okay, so we're not saying that everyone needs to start dropping acid to learn a new language.
Right, of course not.
Yeah.
But it does suggest that there might be something about these substances, this kind of shared mechanism, that allows them to tap in to a state of enhanced brain plasticity even after that traditional critical period has closed.
That's wild.
It is.
But I'm guessing it's not as simple as just taking a pill and boom, you're fluent in Italian, right?
No, not at all. Context is incredibly important here. Our source emphasizes the role of setting the environment, the intention behind the learning. It's not just about the substance itself, it's about how and why you're using it.
That makes sense. You can't just expect to pop a pill and magically absorb knowledge without putting in the effort, right?
Right. They actually give this great example in the source. MDMA can be helpful in therapy, for example, in a controlled setting, for working through trauma.
Right.
But you can't just go to a party, take MDMA, and expect to resolve all your deep-seated issues.
Okay, so setting is key. You need the right environment and the right mindset. So then, with these psychedelics, how do you weigh the potential benefits against the risks? They can make you feel pretty vulnerable, right?
Yeah, definitely. It's definitely a double-edged sword. On one hand, that vulnerability could be beneficial. It could help you break down old patterns and be more open to absorbing new information.
I see.
But yeah, as you said, vulnerability comes with risks too. So it underscores the importance of approaching these substances with a lot of care and respect.
In very specific, controlled environments.
Exactly.
Okay, so we've talked about the potential for psychedelics to maybe nudge open that critical period window again. But what about more, shall we say, conventional approaches?
Well, our source also highlights another podcast that delves into this idea of rewiring the mind.
Rewiring the mind.
Yeah, and
Wow.
it features Dr. Joe Dispenza, who's a big name in this field.
So this is less about directly messing with brain chemistry and more about like the power of our thoughts and beliefs,
Yeah.
right? Like how can we change our thinking patterns to become better learners?
Yeah, exactly. The main idea is that the stories we tell ourselves, about our past, about our limitations, about what we're capable of, they can really hold us back.
Right.
And a lot of times these stories are just assumptions, They're not necessarily true.
So it's like we create these self-fulfilling prophecies in a way.
Yeah, exactly. If you keep telling yourself, I'm bad at math, well, guess what? You're probably going to struggle with math.
It's like setting yourself up for failure almost.
Right. And this podcast delves into how practices like deep meditation can help us break free from those limiting narratives.
Okay.
The idea is that when you meditate, you become more present, more aware of your thoughts without judgment. And when you do that, you start to see those thoughts as just passing mental events. They're not fixed truths about yourself,
Oh, that's interesting.
right?
I guess that allows you to detach from those thoughts and stories and potentially even change them.
Right. It creates space for you to challenge those limiting beliefs and form new, more empowering ones.
It makes me think of that quote the author mentions about not being our story. Like, you are not your idea or story, you are you.
Yeah, exactly. It's a powerful concept.
But I imagine it's a lot harder to put into practice than it is to just understand it intellectually.
It is. There's a big leap between, grasping the concept and actually embodying it. It takes consistent effort and practice. And the author did point out that the podcast seemed to lean more towards like meditation retreats and self-reflection,
Oh, interesting.
which is different from, the traditional approach of talking through your issues with the therapist.
So more of an inward focus rather than an outward focus.
Yeah, exactly.
All right, so shifting gears a bit, we have to talk about this next example. It's pretty mind-blowing. Have you heard of the SEAL's Mind Gym?
Oh yeah, I've read about that. It's pretty incredible what they're able to achieve with their training.
It's insane. Apparently, they can achieve language acquisition that normally takes like 6 months in just 6 weeks.
Wow, 6 weeks. That's amazing.
It's nuts, right? How is that even possible?
Well, according to what I've read, a key part of their method involves using sensory deprivation tanks. Those are also called float tanks.
Float tapes, yeah.
And they combine that with something called audio and visual biofeedback.
Biofeedback, huh? So is that like where they're getting real-time info about their brain waves or their physical responses during the learning process?
Yeah, I think that's the idea.
Yeah.
They're basically trying to create this super relaxed state, both physically and mentally. By minimizing external distractions and providing targeted feedback, they're able to optimize the brain's capacity to absorb and retain new information.
So they're essentially hacking the system.
Kind of, yeah. It's like they're creating the perfect conditions for accelerated learning.
And this all ties back to neuroplasticity, right?
Absolutely.
It's like they're using these techniques to boost their brain's flexibility and receptiveness to new information.
Yeah, exactly. It's fascinating how they're able to achieve similar results to, the psychedelic route, but through these completely different methods.
Right. It's like they're manipulating their brain state to make it more like that of a child during their critical period.
That's a great way to put it.
Okay, so we've got these potential ways to influence brain flexibility, but what about the actual learning process itself? How do we optimize that?
Well, our source introduces this really interesting learning equation.
A learning equation.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward, but it really helps break down the key elements of learning.
Okay, I'm intrigued. What's the equation?
It's absorption power x quantity equals learning.
Absorption power times quantity equals learning. Got it.
Exactly. Yeah.
So let's break that down. What exactly is absorption power?
Absorption power consists of two main ingredients. The first is brain flexibility, which we've already talked about. That's essentially neuroplasticity, and as we've discussed, it's largely influenced by age.
So that part is kind of out of our control, right? Like we can't magically make our brains younger.
Well, not yet at least, but who knows what the future holds.
Right, maybe someday.
But the second ingredient of absorption power is something we can definitely influence, and that's concentration.
Ah, okay. So how focused we are when we're trying to learn something new.
Exactly. And this is influenced by a lot of factors, like how interested you are in the subject or how important it feels. Like if you are lost in the wilderness and needed to learn how to identify edible plants to survive.
Oh, yeah, I bet you'd learn that pretty quickly.
Exactly. Survival is a great motivator.
So motivation and focus are key.
Definitely. And then we have the quantity part of the equation, which is all about putting in the time and effort.
Right. Like the actual practice, the repetition, the doing of the thing.
Exactly. And our source makes a really important point here. Just passively consuming information doesn't count as quantity.
Right.
It's about actively engaging with the skill you want to develop. So if you want to learn to ride a bicycle, you actually have to, ride the bike.
Right. You can't just read about it or watch videos. You have to get on and pedal.
Exactly. Same thing with learning an instrument. It's not enough to just listen to music. You have to sit down and practice those scales, practice those chords.
So it's all about focused, deliberate practice. It's not just about putting in the hours. It's about using those hours effectively.
Absolutely. And this is where I think the equation is really helpful for adult learners. Because even though our brain flexibility might not be what it once was, we still have control over those other two variables.
Right, the concentration and the quantity. So even if we start off with a slight disadvantage in terms of brain flexibility, we can compensate for it by being more focused and disciplined in our practice. And that brings us back to the optimistic note that our source ends on. It's the idea that if the research on things like psychedelics, meditation, even breath work keeps progressing, we might actually find ways to effectively reopen that critical period.
Or at least significantly enhance our brain plasticity as adults.
Imagine that. Like, what if we could dramatically shorten the time it takes to learn a new language or master a new skill?
Yeah, the possibilities are pretty exciting.
It's mind-blowing, right? Like, our source mentions the story about that MMA fighter who was microdosing MDMA to improve his performance.
Yeah, I remember hearing about that.
And apparently he was seeing some crazy results, so maybe that's a glimpse into what's possible.
Maybe. It's definitely an area worth exploring further.
But of course, with any new frontier, there's always the risk of snake oil salesmen.
Right, yeah, definitely. Our source makes a good point about being wary of those brain training schemes that are bound to pop up. It's important to be critical and do your research before jumping into anything that sounds too good to be true.
Absolutely. So to wrap things up, here's what we've learned from this deep dive.
Okay.
While it's true that the critical period gives younger learners a big advantage, our brains aren't necessarily fixed.
Right.
And there's actually a lot we can do as adults to enhance our learning.
Exactly. We have more agency than we might think.
And the key takeaway here is this. There are factors we can control, like our focus, like our dedication to practice, and the potential to explore new methods for influencing brain plasticity.
It's empowering, isn't it, to
Yeah.
realize that we're not just stuck with the brain we have, that we can actually shape it and mold it to become better learners.
It really is. So here's a question for you, dear listener. What if you challenge some of those old beliefs about your learning limitations?
That's a great question.
Like, what if you revisited that language you always wanted to learn, or that instrument you gave up on, or that skill you thought was beyond your reach?
What if you approached it all with a fresh perspective?
Armed with all this new knowledge we've explored today, who knows what you might be capable of achieving? That's something to think about.
Definitely food for thought. I think we've all got some potential waiting to be unlocked.
Absolutely.
It's just a matter of finding the right piece.
And being open to the possibilities. Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this deep dive. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's been fun.
Until next time, keep those brains firing.
And keep learning.